Welcome back. This is Unmissable Movies, episode 6, and you're joining Stephen Hayes.
Hello.
And me, Sam Cox. And this week we are dealing with the classic Muppets in Space. No, we're not really. Can you imagine? Episode 6. We'll save that. We'll save that for a
Jojo Rabbit and then Muppets in Space.
A few years' time. No, this week we are dealing with a classic, a celebrated, venerated, revered great of cinema, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Now, people might hear that we're doing that and think, well, isn't your format that you're highlighting movies that might have been missed? But you think about this film, it's now 45 years old. So this film is as old to, young people now as, we watched a lot of films around the year 2000, for example. So this film is the equivalent of us watching a 1955 movie.
Mm-hmm.
So it's super old. So we're not saying it was missed at the time, but it's a gritty 1970s film that there's probably a lot of people who haven't seen it. And I looked up a little thing on the internet about what films millennials have engaged with, and there was a survey done. And this was a film where, I think it was 60 to 70% of millennials hadn't seen it.
Okay.
So
there you go. So that's important. We've got to keep some of these older movies alive. And like I said, this one is unequivocally a great. I think it's one of the greatest films of all time, not just by my own standard, but it's been entered into the Library of Congress as a culturally significant work. And it's also one of the few films to win the Big Five at the Oscars.
Oh, I didn't know the Big Five was a thing.
So there are 3 movies that have won Best Director, Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay.
Oh yeah.
And this is one of only 3.
Wow.
To have done that. The most recent one was decades after with Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs was the most recent one. And before this, it was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So, yeah, hard to argue that this film hasn't had its moment, but we just want to make sure we keep looking at some of the older movies. Yeah, keep these things alive.
Keep it in the zeitgeist.
Oh, I hate that word.
So do I. I said it with a level of irony.
I thought you did at the time because
it's really hard to say zeitgeist without seeming like a complete dude. So this the rewatch of this film, it made me realize how much of it is just in my DNA now. I quote this film far more than I realize.
Really?
There's loads of things that came up. I was like, oh yeah, I say that most weeks. So I think we must have watched it a lot of times in our kind of teenage years. And I'll say straight away, in every episode, we've had a little moment at the end of the podcast where we say, okay, we've waxed lyrical now. What were the problems with this film? And I'll say now, I haven't got anything because
interesting.
For me, there was no moment where I was like, oh yeah, this is a problem. I'd have to really sit down and think long and hard to find anything that I'm really don't buy into in this film. How was your rewatch?
Oh man, so enjoyable. It's been quite a few years now since I've seen it because I think I sort of overdid it about 10 years ago. Watched it all the time.
Every Saturday morning.
Yeah, so it's been quite a nice gap. And just coming back to it, this is one of the best kind of theater meeting. This is the art of cinema is this movie. This is when it all comes together to form something that, it's like theater meeting.
Yeah.
The craft of movie making, and I loved that, and some of that stuck out to me. But also, I'd forgotten just how good Jack Nicholson is in this film. Every second he's on the camera it's electric. So that was really part of the joy, and I think the rest of the cast do such a good job of creating this conglomerate of sort of just weird, difficult to sort of watch. If you took Jack Nicholson out and it was just the rest of them, this would be probably a terrible movie.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that's actually saying how good a job they do at creating this group of mental patients. Not that they don't, the rest of the cast are just electric as well.
Yeah.
And we'll get onto that. But no, I loved it. I absolutely love this movie. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and before kind of peeling the onion on this one, I think in terms of what you were saying there, Jack Nicholson and his character of R.P. McMurphy, he toes the line perfectly that there's enough normalness there or enough sanity for you to kind of, for him to take you into that journey early on. But there's also enough glimmers that he gives you even in the first scene when he laughs where you think, he's not completely like me in terms of my mental stability.
Yeah, and isn't that, in a way, that's kind of become his thing. Like across all of his career, he's the master of the sort of the suppressed crazy about to explode at any moment.
Yeah.
Guy with this really smooth, leading man kind of exterior.
Yeah.
But we probably should talk quickly about the plot. And I actually think, Steve, on this episode, we can get away with not bringing about some of the big spoilers. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree.
So, okay, so really this movie, so it's based on a book, a novel that came out, I think about 10 or 15 years before the movie by Ken Kesey. And it was, the backstory is pretty cool. It was, the rights to this story were purchased by Kirk Douglas, who wanted to make it into a Broadway play. And he did. He did. It was a play on Broadway, but sometime for a few years in the 1960s, and then I think he always wanted to make it into a movie, and then it just kind of went off the boil, and he couldn't find a studio that wanted to finance it, and eventually Michael Douglas, who was really kind of a producer at the time, decided, let me take this thing off my dad's hands, and I'm gonna make this. I'm gonna get this movie made. So if you watch the credits, one of the producers is actually Michael Douglas.
That's so funny.
And so they got it made. They got a screenplay written up, and the first person to get cast was actually Danny DeVito, who was a good friend of Michael Douglas and had also been on the Broadway run and played a character on the stage version. So that's how the film was kind of birthed. And obviously, there's then a long search for the right cast members. And again, I think because a lot of the studios didn't want to pick this film up, they realized that they would need a big name in the lead role, and that's kind of the reason that Milos Forman, who was an pretty unknown director at the time from Europe, got the gig. There wasn't a big Hollywood director that wanted to take it on.
No, and if you'd asked me before our research for this episode, if you'd said, "Here's 10 grand, tell me who directed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest," I wouldn't have been able to answer it.
I don't know too much about the rest of his directing career, and in a sense,
there's nothing that noteworthy, really.
No, and this film has always been his magnum opus and the thing that sort of has defined him. And I mean, honestly, he's like a revered auteur of cinema verite, which is a style of movie making that this film kind of typifies. And so I don't think that he really needs to sort of earn any extra credit. This is such an incredible film, but. So they all assemble. They eventually hire Jack Nicholson in the lead as Randall R.P. McMurphy. I think Milos Forman wanted it to be Burt Reynolds, and they went through a number of people from Gene Hackman to a couple of other of the big names of the day, and thank goodness they ended up with Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, it seems weird, but Jack Nicholson started his career in the 50s, and he seemed like handsome leading man for a little while. But this seems to be the film that really catapulted him to like, this guy is a heavyweight of cinema. Yeah, and of course, Louise Fletcher, I looked at what she had done before this film, Nurse Ratched, and not a great deal, certainly nothing that noteworthy. But yeah, it's quite funny seeing her in some stuff in the kind of like early 60s where she's like quite an attractive young actress, but she, for this film, turns into a bit of a horror villain.
Yeah, so shall we quickly sum up as best we can the premise of the plot?
So Randall McMurphy, he goes to prison, doesn't he, for assaulted rape, which I think it's underage sex, but it was consensual from what I could see, what I could tell of it. But he's eventually, and a series of assaults. So he's sent from the prison to this psychiatric ward. I don't know what the correct vernacular is. But yeah, so you see him enter into this situation where it's full of psychiatric patients, and he seems very lucid at the beginning, very together, with little, you almost wonder, ADHD kind of, quite hyper. Really, the heart of this movie is his war with Nurse Ratched, really, isn't it? Where he's trying to get her to crack, he's trying to break her, and he places bets on that. And a series of very dramatic events, which goes from field trips out for a boating trip to a crazy party. And yeah, that's basically the main part of it. But as the film progresses, he seems less stable, and basically it seems pretty self-destructive, and that ends pretty badly for him. That's the basic premise.
Yeah. So this ward is a kind of a combination of voluntary patients and kind of committed. It's all men, isn't it? On this particular ward,
Yep.
But yeah, they're on this ward that I think would be viewed as pretty archaic today. But it's at a mental hospital in Oregon, and yeah, she's the matron. She's the one sort of looking after them and working them through their routine and their therapy. And so this kind of firecracker kind of con comes along in R.P. McMurphy, and she kind of sees it as her job to try and help him. But really, pretty quickly we realize she's just a piece of work. She's kind of got this grip over them, this control, this command over them. She knows they're vulnerable, and she kind of gets some kind of a kick out of it. And so, yeah, she really is an icy, cold, horrible figure. And it's really the duo, the battle of those two through the movie.
Louise Fletcher, who played her, said she couldn't re-watch it for years because she was so unnerved by her own performance. And I read somewhere at the end of filming, she kind of did a lap just in her underwear of the set or something, just to show people she wasn't this monster.
Yeah, she's full on, whilst the rest of them are kind of cavorting around and having fun and going through all the the high drama of being a group of fairly unhinged people all in the same space. She has to remain this kind of cold, stoic figure. And I read the same thing, and I think when I was towards the beginning of the movie, I was thinking, like, really, it doesn't seem that intense. But by the end of the film, you're going, man, I can imagine. I can see now why she wouldn't want to have watched the movie for a good while after doing it. And it's a few other things I've read is that just this whole experience was pretty tough. It was a long sort of 15-week shoot, and some of the context is pretty interesting. They all basically lived in this real hospital. They were the reason they filmed at the hospital that they did was because it's a real working hospital that they were given total permission to film in. That was one of the reasons that they decided to go for it. Now it's pretty cool because it actually happens to be the one that's referred to in the book, in the original book. It's that exact one, yeah. So that's they kind of lucked out, and so the cast all assembled, and they all basically had their own room on the ward with their own bed and their own little cubby, and they would sleep there, and it was their dressing room, and they would eat together, and the rehearsal period was basically them sitting around and talking through lines like in a traditional way. And then the other half of every day would just be spent on the ward with patients, just kind of watching, observing, hanging out, getting to know patients. And actually, Milos Forman, the director, he assigned each of the actors a patient to kind of get to know and to sort of begin to mimic. And so it's pretty amazing kind of...
claustrophobic or what?
Yeah, claustrophobic, immersive experience. And I think, one of the things that this film has kind of become revered for is that it's become it's one of the films that defines like naturalistic performance, and there's this extreme intentionality by a director in the way that he works with his actors. And so this whole thing about them living and rehearsing and filming in the actual mental hospital I think is really what propelled that to come through. So Danny DeVito is in this film. He plays one of the patients, Martini. And honestly, like, he's a different person. It's unrecognizable.
Yeah, totally.
And obviously he's like very young. It's one of his early film roles. I don't even know how old he was in this movie, but
20. He's got to be 20 something, surely.
it's just so nothing like I've ever seen Danny DeVito in any other role, and it's like
Danny DeVito in most of the films I've seen him in looks more like his character in Batman Returns than he does than himself in this film, if that makes sense. He just looks nothing like himself. And and one of the joys of rewatching it is you think, oh yeah, like Christopher Lloyd's in this.
Mm-hmm. Christopher Lloyd is amazing in this film.
Like,
I feel like in a way everything he's done since has been these kind of Hollywood, kind of roles, but like this is where you see him as an actor, as like a bit of a thespian, like his intensity, and there's these sort of long pauses on his face as he's absorbing like the conversation, and there's that scene where he kind of flips at one point. And man, talk about an actor throwing everything in that moment.
But he's great in those moments, but then even the subtle things, because I love the bit where, and we'll get into the scenes shortly, but his face when he's introduced as Dr. Tabor, and he just gives that really distinguished kind of sideways nod when they're out on the boat.
I kind of love the way they all do that. It's such a great moment.
It just feels legitimate.
Maybe let's just hit a couple of our favorite scenes, because I think my first favorite scene would be that first group meeting, where they're all sitting around, and it's kind of the moment that you get introduced to all the characters.
Yeah.
But the way that they did it is they never, like normally in a movie you would block exact shots and camera positioning and who's going to be on screen when. But in this, the actors never knew if they were on camera or not. And so just like in theatre where anyone can be watching you at any point, the actors have to just be on and responding and doing things the whole time. And so I love it in that group meeting scene. Like you mentioned, they have those slow zoom ins, and Mac starts flicking his deck of cards, and there's like some jump cuts.
Yeah.
And the camera work, you start to get these random zoom ins on people who are just sort of sitting there watching. And it's just great. It just feels like I've said, it's the camera meeting theatre and acting and directing in one of the most iconic ways of the last.
Yeah, it's also a great introduction to that world, because we're with McMurphy kind of coming into this, and it begins, group therapy session, and they're just talking through Harding's kind of issues that he had with his wife, and it seems okay, but then they start to goad each other. And then it just escalates like so quickly, where he's suddenly like, "It's about heaven, it's about hell." And it's just like, okay, this is what we're dealing with. Yeah. And I love the little looks between McMurphy and Ratchet during that scene, where it's like they're sussing each other out, how they're both sussing out how the other is responding to the situation. And yeah, so much of that carries through the entire film, really, where you've got this thing where they're both trying to basically suss the other out, and it feels like one-upmanship in many ways. And during this watch, I was even trying to figure out, what's Ratchet's motivation? Like, what does she want? She has the chance to get rid of McMurphy, but she doesn't. And you think, is it all power? Is there some good? Yeah, so that scene is really the beginning of that whole relationship, and yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I love the this film it's become so iconic to me that I on the rewatch I noticed just some of that iconic characterization, like the white hat, and the split hairdo that she has. The McMurphy's folded cigarette box, in the sleeve. The chief and the broom handle, like it's just so iconic now to me, and I love that about this film, the way she, in her introduction, she kind of swoops in her black cape.
Yeah, and it made me realise how much of this stuff is so ingrained in pop culture, because you can have never seen this film and so much of it would be recognisable. There's a show in the UK called Spaced with Simon Pegg, and they heavily parody this film in one episode. There's moments from The Simpsons I can remember, and just a smattering of moments where I was like, oh yeah, I've seen this referenced here or there. So it's one of those films that's just been embraced. But as we've said before, it's not necessarily one that a 20-something now would think to put on, unless you are really a film buff who actively seeks out older movies.
Yeah, and I think a little bit like James Dean in
Rebel Without a Cause.
A little bit like James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, or is it with a cause? I can never remember.
He doesn't have a cause. It's without.
He's causeless.
Yeah, he has no cause.
This film for me, and one of the reasons I would encourage anyone to watch it is like a bit like James Dean in that movie. If you want to see Jack Nicholson, like in the absolute prime of his career, if you want to watch Pele, this is the one. This is the one to watch. He got his first Oscar for this film, and you mentioned it already, but he plays that brilliant. He walks that knife edge of like he's sharp as a tack, but is he crazy? But he's sharp as a tack, but hang on, is he crazy?
But yeah, other scenes. I think one of my absolute favorites is when he takes them all out on a boating expedition. But I love it's like a hilariously legitimate outing. Like they get there he steals the hospital minivan, gets them to this boat. They're all wearing life jackets. He teaches them to fish, which is successful, and they all catch fish and gets them back safely. It's like it's just such a hilariously legitimate trip. And I think without that scene, the film might feel too claustrophobic because you're just stuck in the same environment. Whereas this bit, it's like you feel like you're taking your own breath of fresh air in some ways.
Yeah, they did. They filmed the whole thing in sequence, and obviously we're at the hospital for 95% of it. This was the last thing they filmed, and you can sense the kind of elation and the sense of escape and the joy as they all go on this trip together. I've been on a bit on the fence about that scene because, it is relief, but it does change the tone so dramatically. Like suddenly it feels like the Muppet movie as they're all on the bus looking out the window, and even the song. There's a song that plays that like it is a bit jarring.
It's Rainbow Connection, isn't it?
It's something like that. Yeah. Moving right along. And the kind of the ambience change. The walls have literally gone at this whole scene, and but yeah, it's just a great sort of relief moment, and you get a little bit more. You get a bit more of the Mac sort of backstory. Like he knows how to fish. He's got these girlfriends out there, and I think it helps to make sense of his character a bit.
I think it does, and I think I see where you're coming from in terms of it, the tonal shift. But I think he's a live wire, isn't he? So he very seamlessly climbs out. Like you think about all the efforts later on in the movie to escape, and actually he did it pretty damn easily. And you think, well, if anything, the criticism is that he should remember how easily he got out by climbing on the chief's shoulders. Yeah. But I think without that, it's a 2 hours 15 minutes running time, I think, and without that sequence, I think it would be like, oh, it's a slog.
Well, and also there's no, the thing I noticed last night when I watched it was you're just sort of drifting through watching different things happening. There's only two moments that really drive the plot forward in a meaningful way, and it's the trip, and then it's the party where they kind of manage to smuggle some girls into the ward and some booze. And those are the two like big set piece things, other than them just sitting around playing cards and talking, and
but the pacing's great all the same, isn't it?
Oh man, I mean, in a way, my favorite stuff is just those scenes where they're playing cards and bickering, and the scene in the tub room where he's trying to teach them, and he kind of quickly becomes the sort of the ringleader in this sort of circus of guys. Teaches them how to play different card games, and sets up this little gambling ring. It's so entertaining and enjoyable to watch, and actually there's a cool interview with the guy that played the doctor, the main doctor of the hospital, who incidentally isn't an actor. He is the doctor of that hospital. He was the head psychiatric doctor in that hospital for 27 years. Blimey. And the one thing that he did that wasn't being a doctor in his 27-year career was appearing in this movie. And so that's pretty crazy.
That's insane.
Anyway,
it's not like he's got like 3 lines. He's got enough in it to do
no, he's in it quite a lot. But there was an interview with him where he said working with Jack Nicholson was very difficult for a non-actor because he did something different on every single take. You never knew what he was going to do. His eyes, his hands always changed, they're having these conversations, and he would just riff every single time. He would do something different, and you just never knew. He asked Louise Fletcher before they even started filming, what's Nurse Ratchet's first name, because she doesn't have one in the book, she doesn't have one in the screenplay, and she kind of just was like, I don't know, maybe it would be like Mildred or something. And he was like, okay, cool. And then he used it late, like one of the late scenes in the movie when he comes back from electroshock therapy. He sits down and he kind of looks at her and he's like, Mildred, and she blushes. She genuinely blushes because she didn't see it coming. Jack Nicholson kept it in his back pocket for weeks and weeks and weeks and pulled it out at that moment.
Are there any other scenes, Sam, that were like stood out for you?
I think the scene, and I don't want to give too much away, but there's a character called Billy who has this stutter, and he's played by Brad Dourif, and he actually got an Oscar nomination, supporting Oscar nomination.
All right.
And he, in some ways, he's the other truly sort of tragic character in this film, and it's because towards the end of the film, something happens, something he does on the ward.
Can you not do a spoiler, because this is like 1975?
Well, I can do a spoiler about him. I don't want to do the big spoiler, but he basically kills himself. He commits suicide on the ward. And the reason he does that is because Nurse Ratched comes in to the ward after this evening of partying. You know, they have this crazy night where they're all drinking and everything on the ward, and he sleeps with one of R.P. McMurphy's kind of girlfriends. And it's this sort of big, proud, like coming of age moment. All the other guys on the ward are all sort of cheering him on. But when Nurse Ratched comes in and finds out, it's the moment when you really see everything locked together. You see her total grip, her wielding of these men who are essentially, damaged, troubled guys with clear like trauma, and she has a hold on him because she says to him, what would your mother think? Like, what's going to happen when I tell your mother? Me and her are old friends. And you see him start to just gets overwhelmed with fear, and he, they end up needing to drag him away. And then while he's, being dragged away, he kills himself. He slits his wrists. And that's the moment when everything comes into sharp focus. Like Mac's sort of suppressed rage about Nurse Ratched, her like absolute fury, like the look in her eyes in that scene.
That thing she says when she comes out, where she's like, the best thing we can do is go back to our daily routine. Yeah. I think, flipping heck.
Yeah, and it's just an amazing scene. There, it's kind of crazy. It's frantic. Everybody's, it's like high drama. Everybody's acting their faces off. And I think, it's for the plot, for the acting, just for a number of reasons. I think that's one of the most sort of affecting moments in the movie, where there's been lots of suppression and, sitting around slowly, things are bubbling away. This is the scene where everything just explodes and propels you really into the last few moments of the movie.
Well, I suppose her job is to keep these men safe and to keep them calm, and goading them is not her job. So she effectively signs his death sentence when she says, "I'm telling your mum," because she knows what she's doing. Mm-hmm. She knows the degree of anguish that puts on that individual. And what's incredible is, and you're right with McMurphy, because he gives up freedom. Like, he's got the window to his right, and he's got the scream that he just heard to his left, and he follows the scream. Like he could have escaped with.
Yeah, that's it. So true.
But he doesn't. He goes over. He makes that choice, which ultimately, doesn't end well for him in many ways, or in every single way. Yeah. So yeah, it's pretty bleak. So should we move on to a bit of dialogue, Sam? Lines that we enjoyed.
You might have more to say on this than me. I just find so much of, McMurphy's dialogue is just so full of just life and humor, and you get the feeling that, and I don't know whether this is true, you get the feeling that Jack Nicholson's improvising all the time, but I don't know if that's the case. But there's just loads of little lines, like when he's being strapped in to have his first shock therapy treatment, and he's quoting an old hair pomade ad, and he's like, "A little dabble, do ya?" You know, they're putting the conductive gel on his temples, and just his kind of the whole premise of this film is this guy's spirit essentially going to get crushed?
Yeah.
And even in those moments where you're sort of watching that process actually happen, he manages to still have this spark. You know, he comes back. He comes
Irreverent.
back after. Yeah, he comes back in after his first electroshock therapy treatment, and he's sort of shuffling along, and they all think, "Oh my goodness!" Like, you know, he's like had half of his brain fried out. But then he winks to them, and then he, you know, oh, here we go. He hasn't actually. He's back. And he says things like, you know, "Old Goose Randall McMurphy back in action. The Mental Defective League, we're in formation." You know, there's just so many of those little lines that I love.
After the first time you've seen it, though, it serves as a pretty dark foreshadowing to where things end up. That's the only kind of, when you watch that the second time or third time or whatever, it's like he's joking now, but you know where it ends up. There's so many things, like I said earlier. There's so many things I just use in day-to-day life. So when Tabor's like, play the game, play the game, play the game, I have that in my head whenever someone's dawdling and I want them to do something. I just want to tap them and say, play the game. I also love when he says to Harding, "Why don't you just knock off the bullshit and get to the point?" Because I'd love to be able to say that at points in my life.
Are there any kind of like serious, non-funny lines that sort of stick out?
Probably the one I already said. The best thing we can do is go back to our daily routine. Like, that line sums up her Nurse Ratchet's entire being, I suppose. Like, she's just this cold, icy, unfeeling. The only time in the film where she seems to show any emotion is when she's being strangled to death by McMurphy. So, yeah,
she doesn't die. Or
Sorry?
does she? I said she doesn't die. Or
she's
does
in
she?
a neck brace in the final scene.
Oh. I thought we were trying not to give too many spoilers away.
Is the neck brace a spoiler?
To you listeners out there, I'm trying my best. Steven's just peeing all over it.
All right, here's a question. Were you surprised by the lack of cuckoos?
I was. Well, I was hoping to see at least one.
Who's that referring to? It's such an odd title.
It's from the book, and it's included in it's an old American like poem that kids read, like a bit like Ring Around the Roses, you know, we would. Yeah, it's that, but it's I don't know whether Cuckoo's Nest was a sort of a derogatory term for mental institutions at the time.
Sure. There's no kind of obvious lines of dialogue that stick out to me, but I think it's Scatman Crothers. As Turkle. He's just brilliant for the time he's in the film. I mean, he's like the night porter, and his willingness to just let the ladies in is just it's just hilarious, and how fast he lives to regret those decisions.
Yeah,
and he's also in The Shining with Jack Nicholson, of course, as well.
Yeah, I know. I read that. I thought when I was watching it, man, this is the second movie I've seen him in with where these two are together.
Yeah,
but it turns out there's another two. They've been
with him and Nicholson.
Yeah, there've been 4 films together that they were in. I don't know the other
right?
two offhand, but
all right.
So it's interesting you mentioned Scatman Crothers, because for me, as much as he's just funny and some of his dialogue is funny, I wondered, as I was digging desperately for issues with this film, I wondered whether he was possibly one. And the only reason I say it is this film is like overly, well, not overly, I mean it's perfectly intentional about that reality factor, you know, the sense that this is all very natural, and you know, the way the lines were all delivered, and the efforts that Milos Forman went to create this sort of reality, this cinema verite thing. Mm-hmm. For me, there's a couple of moments where Crothers feels like he's just not quite he's just a bit distracting, like maybe he's not quite convincing enough as an actor. And I don't know tons about him, but I know he was also a jazz musician and kind of a popular sort of figure, and did some films, but there's a couple of moments where I'm aware that he's acting.
Yeah.
But honestly, that was the only thing I could think of. You know, in a sense, this film isn't about the equal coming together of editing and cinematography and score. Like, this film is about reality and about acting and about that relationship between a director and his cast.
And it's of the time. You know, I thought the same thing. I was like, it's not very cinematic, but then, you know, it's of the time. Like, it kind of makes me want to go and rewatch Taxi Driver and Kramer versus Kramer, like like when all these kind of icons of cinema were kind of still kind of early in their careers, and it was just such a good time for like really artsy stuff.
Yeah, I remember I did study some film at university, and I don't remember a lot about it, but I remember there being, you know, the 70s in American cinema was definitely a response to, you know, the Vietnam War and kind of this very angsty paranoia era, you know. So you had like films like this, films like The Conversation with Gene Hackman. You had, you know, Kramer versus Kramer. You had Jaws, even, which was a kind of another similar movie, even though much more blockbuster, about sort of angst and paranoia. And you know, and that was just the 70s. You know, it was like Star Wars was really the movie that broke that. You know, in '77, that was the movie that kind of ushered in the '80s, which was, you know, Indiana Jones and the Star Wars thing and E.T. and really the age of Spielberg proper. And so this film like typifies that pre-blockbuster era of cinema that in a way we're still in. You know, those big blockbuster movies are still the ones that sort of people tend to go out and see, the big summer hit films.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So this movie, One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest, is kind of one of the last films of this sort of era, and another reason that I think, you know, you have to go out and see this film. Yeah. Actually, you're not going to go out and see this film. You're going to just rent it. Where are you going to go out and see it?
I don't know. Some retro cinema that's got seats 2 meters away from each other, perhaps. So, Sam, I just thought of something that could be a weekly segment, perhaps, when we look at older films. And the question is, who would you cast now? So if this film was never made and you were the casting director for this film, who would you cast as Nicholson in McMurphy's role and Nurse Ratched? Now, it's a bit off the cuff, so I won't ask you to say now. But that might be one for our listeners to think about. Who would you, if you had to recast this film and those two leads, who would you go for? And send us a message on social media, because it'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, it would. Do you know, what about Jeffrey Rush? Jokes.
What about Jack Black?
He could play Martini. What about Kate Winslet as Nurse Ratched?
She could do that.
Yeah, I think she could. Now, finding the right person for R.P. McMurphy, that's another question.
If it were 10 years ago, DiCaprio would be the obvious choice, probably. But I don't think there's that many great actors now that are up and coming to that same. You know, I think when we were growing up, you looked at, you know, your Depps, Pitts, DiCaprios. Yeah,
Tom Hanks, even Costner. Yeah. They were all there.
Spacey before his fall from grace, that you knew that these people were going to go on to be amazing actors. I can't really think of many, if any, now that I'm like, oh yeah, they'll be great when they're...
Charlie Sheen.
Robert Pattinson. Don't even know his name properly to say it. Right, well, that brings us to, I think, a pretty natural close. Thanks everyone for listening / watching. It was great to look at such a incredible film again, and we'll be with you soon with another episode.
Muppets in Space.
Thanks for listening.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed that, don't forget to click the like button. You can share this with your friends on Twitter and Facebook, TikTok probably. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.